Hello, and welcome to another episode of Politics at the Crossroads, the podcast that sits at the intersection of politics and Christian faith. In episode 7, the penultimate episode of this series, I had the pleasure of speaking with Matt Wilson. Hailing from Manchester, Matt is Managing Director of Goodlabs, a management consultancy helping organisations to enhance their social impact. Matt is also a Labour and Cooperative councillor based in North Shields. In our conversation, we discussed the overlap and tension between Matt's political convictions and the Pentecostal tradition he grew up in, the scriptural roots of common philanthropy, or collective giving, and the importance of considering the structural nature of injustices in society. I hope that you enjoy the conversation. All right, well, Matt, my first question for you is a stock question that I ask everyone, which is looking at where you sit or stand, both politically and theologically. I wonder if you could sort of paint a picture for us as to where you stand in both of those, and maybe perhaps a little bit about yourself as well and what you do, if that isn't too much.
Yeah, thanks, Simeon, and thanks for inviting me to come and talk with you today. You probably tell by the accent, although it's a little bit hidden. I am from the north of England. That's where I'm joining you from today. I'm based in Tyneside now, although you'll definitely tell by my accent that I'm not a Tyneside local. If you were talking to my next door neighbour, you might need subtitles. So the north, council estates, declining industries, a rather bleak sort of future horizon. That was the kind of childhood that I grew up with. But that was kind of combined with Pentecostal church, a kind of wacky but sincere expression of faith that was sort of in the air of my childhood. And church was a kind of a busy hub of working class life, really. And so in that sense, church was kind of as a kid, I remember being a bit of a fascination, really. It was a curiosity. It was, things happened in church that really didn't happen in the rest of life. And I think that's one of the things about, the Pentecostal expression of faith. It's quite lively and kind of spiritual stuff happens. But because later that became a total embarrassment to me as a teenager. And, so that was about, and I find sort of various, you got to bear in mind, I was a teenager in the sort of late 80s, Simeon. So it was kind of, the indie scene and the rave scene and all that kind of thing were happening. And so that gave me plenty of opportunity to sort of, I guess, discover alternative kind of community and a kind of escape from the sort of bleakness of, the economic bleakness, the kind of prospects. Because, I wasn't born into any kind of privilege. I went to, pretty rubbish schools. My first job was in a scrapyard. And so there's a sense that, finding something to make life interesting was what my sort of early life was about. But that became sort of formational to me because I guess my entire early life was about the view from below. That's just the way that life was. And so in that sense, it was sort of foundational and kind of set me up for, a later involvement in politics on the left, kind of by virtue of eventually making it to university, which I did not through any great academic gift, but actually just because I was good at drawing. So I did an art degree, and it was in Manchester that I kind of rediscovered that sort of childhood faith. And together with a bunch of mates, all quite enthusiastic young Christians, we relocated ourselves into a council estate in a rough part of town, and that became, we were there to sort of affect change as best we could, to love and care for people, particularly some of the youngsters who were getting into a lot of trouble. And that became the sort of the dominant thing for the next 15 years of my life, really. Was involvement in that kind of work, being a champion of kind of grassroots Christian action in those very deprived kind of communities. But I suppose in those years as well, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the kind of, it was a very sort of strongly evangelical kind of atmosphere, and I didn't sit very easily within that. I was becoming a bit more liberal in my own outlook and beliefs and attitudes, and that was kind of hard to admit to that crowd of people, because liberals were sort of heretics. So yeah, there's a bit of background for you.
And I understand that you wear quite a number of different hats. Just now, you're
Right.
head of, you're leading a consultancy. You're involved with collective philanthropy. You're a Labour councillor.
Yeah.
Must keep you pretty busy. In terms of your own sort of political and theological, perhaps where you sit now, how would you care to sort of identify one way or the other, where you are?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's see how well I can put that. The experience at the grassroots was that our individualized attempts at change, which were clearly really important. Somebody who's in hardship often needs someone to be there for them, give them a helping hand. But it's very, very evident there's a sort of a structural kind of macroeconomic reasons, policy decisions, reasons why areas continue to be poor generation after generation. And it was those sort of big picture issues, I suppose, that began to vex me. But also, I was coming into contact with political representatives. I would find myself dealing with local councillors, or being down in Westminster, lobbying MPs, etc., or invited to speak, or be at round tables or this kind of thing. And so, yeah, people started to say to me, Matt, perhaps you ought to think about, getting involved in politics yourself. So I joined the Labour Party. And it was then when I kind of got more actively involved in politics through becoming a Labour Party member, that I started to see there wasn't just this kind of unified lump called, the Labour Party or the left. But oh my goodness, you peel back the carpet and there was so much going on and wriggling under there. All these various, factions to bump into. And as a newcomer, I remember my first Labour Party meeting. It was hardly welcoming. There's considerable amount of suspicion. I might be, I don't know what they thought I was, some sort of kind of, secret agent. People didn't. This is going to go back a few years. More recently we had a big influx of new members. I mean, I'm the membership sort of secretary now for my constituency, but yeah, it wasn't a kind of a thing that was done. We don't get new people around here, kind of thing.
Right. Okay. That's interesting.
And so it was a steep learning curve. But hearing people talk in meetings and at conferences, and after at the pub, and especially when people had loosened up after a few drinks, I found myself thinking, well, quite often, I'm not sure I agree with you actually, but not necessarily being able to express why. So I think that was a real prompt for me to figure out, where do I stand? Because just because I'm a card carrying Labour Party member, and I've subscribed to these commitments on the back of the card, I don't seem to necessarily belong to. I can't figure out which, if any, of these little factions I might want to belong to. I guess apart from, at the time, the people who were kind of, I guess, most welcoming were what was at the time known as the Christian Socialist Movement, run at the time by Andy Flanagan,
Yes.
who thankfully rebranded it as Christians on the Left, because I think, as he said to me at the time, people's criticism of the Christian Socialist Movement is that it's neither Christian, socialist, nor a movement. So that was,
I should say that I just had Hannah on the previous episode as well. So
okay, yeah, good stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think three things stood out for me, Simeon, and the first one ought to be really obvious, that holding political office is about serving others and not self-advancement. Now, you would think that's really obvious, and that was obvious to me as somebody who had a Christian ethic, but clearly wasn't the ethic that others were following. There's a lot of self-advancement in politics, and that's right across the party system. There's a lot of careerism, a lot of self-pimping going on, and people want to get ahead and make a name and a career for themselves. But also, and then this is more to do with the point specifically about being on the left. The Labour movement originally formed and saw its early successes as a collective endeavour. 100 years ago, the Labour Party and what it was doing as it was forming itself as a party, trying to get people into Parliament, it was formed on really thick relational solidarity. What was happening, in the different strikes that were taking place in the early part of the 20th century. You think of the London dock workers strike, and the way that Methodists and Catholics sort of joined hands together to get a fair wage on the docks. That it was really thick relationship that was taking place across, actually even across sectarian divides, and so that is fundamentally in tension with the forms of liberalism that emerged then in the later part of the 20th century that really do elevate the individual above all else. And so there's this sort of permanent friction there at the heart of it, because liberty and liberation rightly remain huge themes on the left, but they're often, I find, poorly thought through and argued, and there's kind of a collective blind spot around how can we have both these things coexisting. How can we have this sort of thick relational solidarity that has always been the success factor of what our movement has been about, and then this elevation of the individual and their rights trumping everything else. So it's a problem. And then so that maybe takes me to my third point, and so I will shut up in a minute. But and that's, I think, the state being too frequently seen as the answer. And so I see this, from my own vantage point in local government, I see this around the provision of services, but I guess also sort of at macroeconomic level, there's a sort of a lack of recognition of the importance of civil society, non-political voluntary action, intermediary institutions. And I guess that's my blue Labour streak coming out. That's my point of connection with Maurice Glasman. And, I've had a bit to do with blue Labour over the years, less so since Brexit, because I disagreed with friends over that. But, the point was about solidarity. The point I just made about solidarity, in a sense, this final point is about subsidiarity. And I think that's been sort of lost as well. And I think it also explains what attracts me to the cooperative movement, because I'm a Labour cooperative councillor. I kind of wear two hats in that sense. We've got an electoral pact. And yeah, so that's where I stand, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. That's very interesting as well, that issues of liberty and liberation are, and I suppose individual and community are ones that I've been thinking through a lot as well.
I don't know if it would be helpful. Sorry, but
yeah,
maybe I've talked in kind of highfalutin terms there. I don't know if it would be worth me giving a couple of examples of how that might look in terms of kind of policy terms or whatever. So
yeah, absolutely.
For example, people can be cast, and this is on the left as well as on the right. People can be cast as economic units. And so that can be the case for both Marxists and for Blairists alike. The glorification of the worker, the recovering of the means of production through class struggle, on the sort of Marxist side, or, on the kind of, the Blairite side, it's the aspirant young person for whom equality of opportunity means, going to university 200 miles away, but then losing all connection with the community that formed you. Or the debate around nationalising utilities. Do we end up with a huge Department of Energy in London, or can we organise some kind of regionalised or even localised system of accountability for utility ownership? Especially when it comes to things like water and power generation. So in policy terms, that's why these things matter.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. That put some flesh on the bones. I came across you and your own work, Matt, after a piece that you wrote just after the 2019 election, which is entitled Labour's Liberal Blind Spot, which I thought was a very confronting but an honest take on what had gone wrong in the Labour Party, particularly the intellectual and party leadership at the time. And my take on what you were arguing in that piece was that, in essence, the problem was down to an unwillingness within the Labour Party, or particularly the leadership, to engage with, you put it as social conservatism. I would probably think of it perhaps more as cultural conservatism, but, the topics of family, flag and faith, which you suggest in that piece, were taboo, where, if you engage with these, you're moving to the right, and that side of bounds kind of thing. I don't want to necessarily make this a party political question. I'd rather want to kind of zoom out and think about this as Christians. What do you think, my question is, what do you think it would mean for us as Christians to engage with liberalism, particularly with social cultural liberalism, rightly? In other words, what would it mean for us as humans and as Christians to confront liberalism head on, as I say, particularly culturally, with truth and with grace, and holding on to what is good while rejecting some of its excesses?
Yeah, that's a deep one. So, we are in a really odd time politically. Some call it an interregnum, and I can agree with that in the sense that we do feel, as a country, perhaps a bit like a parish without a vicar. We're sort of bumbling from one problem to another and hoping it will end soon. But it isn't just leadership that we lack. That kind of diagnosis leads to the election of Trump and Erdogan and Bolsonaro. I think we lack virtue, and so I think that's got to be part of that engagement with liberalism, because I think liberalism has a difficulty with virtue, and most of all with empathy. Because I think that the virtue of empathy, that's why our society cannot conceive of a common good, because the common good requires us to lean in and to understand each other, and we don't seem to want to do that. We've got a big debate going on at the moment as we talk, and who knows when people will be listening to this. But over the weekend we've had the Clapham Common demonstration and the heavy-handed Met Police, and so that issue around women and their safety is a really hot topic. But I don't see many men really being willing to do the work to lean in and ask why, to try and empathize and walk a mile in a woman's shoes. Not that we're going to sort of put our heels on and kind of, well, maybe we will, I don't know. What does it feel like? How can we imagine what it actually is like there? And we require some really deep empathy in that sort of situation. And so the common good then, so it involves sort of forming a vision together of what, the kind of society we want to be. And that's what liberalism has never been able to conceive of, because it's just the sum of everyone's choices, rather than leaning into a debate about what kind of society do we want to be. But if we just follow the logic of liberalism, then, we'll believe that the New Jerusalem that can come about, just by accident, because we all make market choices or individualized decisions. And so but here's the other side of it, is that I started to notice that a lot of the people that I admired for their advancement of post-liberal arguments were kind of curiously quiet on issues that I feel are really important. So that issue we just talked about, the issue of women's equality, or we might talk about, the issue of racial injustice. We've had Black Lives Matter is a huge thing. Just a couple of weeks ago, a week ago, we had the Harry and Meghan interview, which has blown up the whole issue of, racism in the royal family. And, some people would say, racism in the royal family? Really? How could that be? But these are the things I don't see those kind of post-liberal voices that I've been listening to in recent years seeming to be concerned about these things. And so there is a sense, I wonder then whether, and this has been bothering me, so some of what passes off as post-liberalism is just conservatism with a new frock on. And I've been actually wondering whether, to truly be post-liberal, you first have to be liberal. You've kind of got to go through it and come out the other side in order to be able to comment. It involves learning from liberalism, celebration of its achievements,
Oh, yeah.
but also a reckoning with its failures. And only from that point, both inspired but also chastened, can we move forward. And I think, that, so when I talk in that article, which uses kind of blue Labour, that sort of, triple typology around faith, family, and flag, I think I said in that article, can any of us imagine a Labour politician saying that, when a child grows up with a mum and dad who are married, isn't that brilliant? Or, who can imagine a Labour politician saying, St. George's Day is coming up. I'm really looking forward to celebrating it. Or, what about, I'm so excited that so many people in this country are religious. Isn't that great? Those ideas sound fantastical. They're from the pages of Alice in Wonderland. And yet, actually, those are all things that make our lives so significant. They're things that bring us together, give us identity, give us purpose. We don't seem to be able to talk about them.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting as well, drawing in on what you said about in order to be post-liberal, one has to be liberal. One of my recent guests was Tim Farron, Liberal Democrat MP, and I was very challenged by that because I think that he drew attention to liberalism as essentially being a marketplace of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Liberalism less as a political philosophy and almost as a principle that there exists a marketplace of ideas in which we can debate, and the strength of liberalism being, in a sense, diversity. That's obviously the roots of the Liberal Party, where toleration for nonconformists, right,
Mm-hmm.
who were being persecuted quite badly by the Anglican Church, and Jews as well. So the Liberal Party was standing up for those who didn't have a voice in that sense. And in a sense, it's quite easy to be an Anglican post-liberal today. Much more difficult to be, I don't know, something else around the edges. And so I just come back to this principle of what you were saying there, liberalism celebrating that core principle of being a marketplace of ideas with which we, and I think that's under threat, isn't it? To me, it seems to be under threat, that sense of having a debate about things and being able to disagree well.
Well, I mean, nobody would be better equipped to talk to you about that than Tim Farron, really. In terms of the narrowing and the closing down of debate around certain issues. So probably much better equipped to talk to you about that than I am. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks so much for your reflections on that. I want to move on. That's sort of the political side of things. Moving then to your Christian faith, your denominational affiliation. I'm really fascinated with how particular denominational affiliations impact political and cultural convictions. I've spoken with post-liberals, quote unquote, who would draw heavily on the Catholic tradition, Catholic social teaching. As I said, liberals who draw on nonconformist traditions and others. And you've spoken there about the Pentecostal tradition. I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about your experience within that. What do you think Pentecostal theology done rightly, or Pentecostal communities, particularly the strong African flavor within the UK? What might they have to contribute to the political moment that we're in just now?
Yeah, sure. Well, they say you can't choose your family, don't they? And I suppose that's my relationship with Pentecostalism. It was the family I was born into, really. And actually, having a brief flirtation with Anglicanism, only by virtue of kind of living in London a couple of years. I think I was glad to find my way back home again. So the Pentecostal traditions always had quite a heavy emphasis on spiritual experience, and in that sense, it can be a bit otherworldly. There can be a sort of an ark of salvation mentality, to use a phrase from Vincent Donovan. But what it does have going for it, however, and this is something that's often made light of. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody use that little joke that goes, they've got more flags than a Pentecostal church. But so, as you might expect, the day of Pentecost is a big deal for Penties. And there's sort of something of an association, though, between the gift of tongues, which is sort of at the heart of the Pentecostal experience, and the fellowship of all nations. It's kind of a reverse Babel that's happening. And so I've found, just in my own experience, that Pentecostal churches have been probably the most welcoming multicultural communities that I've ever known. So, if you go into any sort of town or city, I think generally, if you want to find a multicultural community, you'll seek out a Pentecostal church. I know there are exceptions to that rule, and that there are, sadly, lots of expressions of kind of only white or only black Pentecostalism. But thankfully, then there's a lot of very well blended Pentecostal congregations, and so I think it's a kind of a multiculturalism, but it's a profoundly different kind of multiculturalism than the sort of liberal version that Britain has known over the last 30 or 40 years. And so you do find this wonderful sort of fellowship, this unity in diversity, and it's something that our world really, really needs right now. And I think perhaps what the Pentecostals have without realizing it, in terms of something going on there, is this sense that we have more in common, as the late Joe Cox was fond of saying. So yeah, there's definitely something about that. There's something about the way that Pentecostals just seem to get. It doesn't mean that you can't find a racist Pentecostal. I'm sure they exist, but there is something lovely about the way that their communities form in an inclusive way. I would also say there's probably something about structurally that makes the Pentecostal tradition interesting too, because most Pentecostal sort of communities, they are community churches with a sort of a self-organizing nature. So while there are denominational structures, I never get the impression they're quite so hierarchical as they are particularly within Anglicanism, but also even perhaps within the sort of, Methodist tradition as well, or certainly not within the Catholic tradition. Very, very sort of hierarchical structures. I think to some extent, it's hard for me to speak about African Pentecostalism because that's not the tradition that I'm in. And I know there are African Pentecostal denominations that kind of mimic systems of bishops and that sort of thing. But on the whole, I think what does mark Pentecostal churches is a high degree of local autonomy, with a kind of a subsidiarity principle in there, when it comes to decision making and just getting on with it. I don't think I've ever heard a Pentecostal use the word subsidiarity, but I see it practiced all the time.
Which is perhaps more important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's an interesting blend of your sort of political and theological convictions right there. That's Thank you very much. I wonder if we can move on to looking at economics and your work with Common Change. So zooming in on a specific issue. As I mentioned before, you wear a number of different hats. One of these is your involvement, both practically and in terms of research, on the issue of collective giving, collective philanthropy. So you're chair, I believe, at Common Good,
Common Change, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Common Change.
Yeah, we do. We actually do an event though called Common Good Canteen, so that's where you might have got that from. Yeah.
Okay. And this promotes collective philanthropy, where, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, you can kind of go into what you're doing there. It's an international organization where people group together and pool funds to support those who have come into some form of economic hardship. Could you just tell us a bit about your work with Common Change and the model of common philanthropy, collective giving, and sort of why your Christian faith motivates you to do this?
So I guess Common Change it's one of the parts of my life where my sort of theology and my politics and my economics flow most naturally together. I think it's where the I and the we come together really, really nicely. And I guess it's built on the principle that if we can't voluntarily experience and enjoy the possibilities that come from having a shared aspect to our economic lives, then how on earth can we expect changes in economic policy to do any better? If kind of behaviour is forced on us through, rules of taxation or whatever. So surely we ought to be able to practice this ourselves voluntarily. We ought to be able to hold ourselves to a higher standard economically, if that's what we truly do see when we read the scriptures. And so in my own study, I think I did a research fellowship a couple of years ago over at Durham, which was kindly funded by one of our local trusts up here in the northeast, called the William Leach Fellowship. And so I guess it was a bit of the scales slowly falling from my eyes, really. I was reading a lot of Walter Brueggemann, particularly his work around money and possessions in the Old Testament, although he does deal with the New Testament as well, which was fascinating. But I think it's just a case of realizing just how much of an economic story is going on biblically, how it is about organizing a kind of a just and inclusive economic life that people share in. But particularly when you get into the New Testament, it's how do you deal with that really hard stuff around the early part of the book of Acts, when there's this incredibly radical experiment going on in Jerusalem that kind of looks a bit like a commune or something. And I never really properly understood that. And certainly it doesn't necessarily seem to be replicated then in the later church plants that happen as the gospel travels around the Mediterranean. There's still quite a radical sort of economic ethic going on, but it doesn't seem to be a replication of what happened in the early days of Jerusalem in terms of the wholesale sort of sharing everything in common. But what does seem to be clear, and particularly, you read the sort of patristic writers writing about, who often comment on the way that early Christians used their money, or that early churches were structured around their money. There definitely was. Shared funds were part of the story, sort of undoubtedly. And I think my reflection is that what we've done in the way that now modern churches are organized is, we put our money into the collection basket and it goes away, and some committee or pastor or whatever makes a decision about what's going to happen to that money, which generally means paying their own salary and keeping the bills paid. But very little. The early story of how money was used in the church was largely for benevolence. It was largely outward facing. It was meeting needs in the immediate community of faith, and then beyond it as well. There was real overflow. There was always a surplus that was going to meet the needs of others in the community. You have to go to Acts sort of 6 and think about the way that the widows were cared for and the distribution of the bread and all that kind of stuff. But then you get into, later books, and they're starting to scratch their heads and think about policies around, well, hang about a minute, what if somebody's widowed, but then they get another husband? Do they still qualify for a bread ration? Or, what if somebody's kind of able to work, but isn't? Should we make sure they get a job before we give them some support? They're wrestling with all the policy stuff going on there. So what Common Change does is it fundamentally enables us to administrates so that, for instance, you and your friends could decide, we're going to do a bit of a common pot. We're not all putting 100% of our salaries in there. We might just be putting, 1% of our income into the pot every month, or whatever you choose to do. But the point is, you've moved from your economics being just about me, and you've made it larger. You're now including some other people. You're starting to have conversations you never had before about, crikey, we've got some money here. What are we going to do with it? It's burning a hole in your collective pocket. And so you actually start to walk around your community feeling empowered around, right, if I bump into somebody who's got a need today, together with my friends, we might be able to do something about that. So that's what we sort of exist for, really, is to try and I guess there's a double side to it, to enable, the living into a radical heritage in terms of the economics of it and having a shared bit of our economic life, but also actually recapturing some hands-on giving rather than giving being this sort of very mechanical, almost invisible direct debit thing that goes on, where you're no longer participating in the gift, really. It's not a dynamic thing anymore. So yeah.
Thank you. That was excellent, and drew in on my next question, which is going to look at your fellowship at Durham, and I guess you might have interacted a bit with John Barclay there. By being
Well, I interacted with him a bit. I mean, it was in the days when we could go and have coffee. Yeah, so I certainly made the most of the opportunity of having coffee with lots of interesting professors.
Yeah, I mean his stuff on reciprocity and Paul, and the idea that relationships between different individuals or communities, I mean, they are relationships first of all, and there's reciprocity there, which we seem to, I think we've, as I read Barclay, it seems like we've bought into kind of this altruistic notion of I just give and that's it, there's no relationship there, which is actually Barclay wants to say, well, in fact there sort of are terms and conditions in a sense. Well, he would say there are strings attached to these.
Oh no, absolutely. Yeah, no, he talks a lot about the obligation that is created, and how problematic that can be.
Yeah.
And
problematic, and also generative, and also potentially a good thing. It can lead to manipulation, but also can create a relationship of if not equals, well, the poorer community might be able to give something relationally poor as in economic terms to the sort of wealthier economic party.
Yeah, here's where I got to with that. And so, yeah, I found John's work really, really helpful, particularly the stuff, the historical stuff around what was going on. He writes extensively about, giving and reciprocity within Roman society, and the whole, pecking order of patronage and all that kind of stuff, which I think once you begin to practice what we call relational giving, and in fact Common changed its original iteration, its name was relational tithe, you soon find out that this reciprocity or this obligation principle is alive and well. I mean, we've only got sort of dim reflections of it in our culture. It's sometimes why, if you're in a pub and somebody offers to get a round in, sometimes people will withdraw. They don't want to be part of the round because they know that if they're in the round, they're going to have to buy a round. And so we've still got some of these weird cultural artifacts around the reciprocity and giving. But where I got to was around, I really did come to the conclusion that in terms of what does God want? And I think that is a pay it forward kind of, I guess that's the simplest terms I can put it in. Freely you have received, freely give. Or forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. There's a kind of a pivot that takes place. We received gift, we pivot, we hand on gift. And so there's some work been done around but there's not really a language for it. So it is a form of reciprocity, but the gift is not bouncing back to the original giver, but it's bouncing on. And so, when we're involved in giving to others, we were extremely careful not to set up an obligation on that individual to want to pay us back. But, we will say, if they desperately feel like, they're thankful that somebody's come and helped them out, but it'll be more a conversation around, well, look, if your circumstances change and if ever in the future you're in a position to be able to give a gift to yourself, don't think you have to give it back to us, but find somebody else that you can, might not say bless, but that's the principle at work. Yeah,
that's really helpful. Thank you. That's really interesting as well in terms of, that's in a sense moving away from potential manipulative modes of giving to perhaps that those blessings and gifts are benefiting a wider pool of people.
Well, it's there in the Sermon on the Mount as well. I think that's where we get in trouble, because we're so private about our giving, because Jesus says, don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. But, why did he say that? He said that because people were coming into the temple and making a big show of how much they were putting in the box. So, clearly that's not where we want to be. It's not about, look at me, aren't I a great giver? There's got to be a great discretion in the giving, but in a sense, within the giving club, within the group of friends who have chosen to be accountable to one another for the common fund, they can be transparent and open with each other and should be.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I think this brings me to my final question, Matt, which comes from the name of this series, so the Crossroads, looking at the crossroads of Christian faith and politics, and looking at where each might learn from the other. And I do think personally that Christian faith can learn from political traditions and political reflection more broadly. So my question goes in both directions there. So firstly, what does your Christian faith have to say to or contribute to your political convictions? And then conversely, what does your Christian faith have to learn from your political tradition?
Yeah, thanks, Simeon. Well, I think when it's working well, working properly, the Christian faith functions as a leveler. And so that's hugely important in a grotesquely unequal world. And I guess the communion table is the ultimate example. And that's probably also where the Pentecostal tradition stands out for me, because we receive the sacraments from one another in the Pentecostal tradition, not from a priest. And so there's absolutely no hierarchy present at the table. And so I think that certainly speaks to my politics in quite a powerful way. Now, the party political system, as far as I'm concerned, therefore, it's way too hierarchical. There's too many people clinging on to roles and titles. It's full of petty little fiefdoms. And so how we, certainly on the left, how we practice what we preach in terms of equality, in terms of democracy, it's hugely important, and I think learns a lot from that. And that's from a Christian root that I'm coming from there, really. And I guess that's where I share a lot with R.H. Tawney, who's one of my great heroes. That's where his Christian socialism came from, sort of recognition that there's a kind of an equal dignity and worth, there's a kind of a moral value to life that nobody's sort of, Tawney was, from, the sort of higher echelons of society. His father was a sort of a bigwig in the British Empire, I think, ran something or other in India. But Tawney really stepped down. That was the story of his life. He was in the Battle of the Somme, he was wounded, he dedicated his life to workers' education. And so I think that runs quite deep with me, and that's absolutely my Christian faith speaking to my politics. In terms of what my faith could probably learn from my politics, well, I think about contemporary religion, especially of the evangelical variety, and I guess it falters in that shift from individual morality to structural injustice. And politics, quite naturally, especially politics on the left, sees that structures can be oppressive, and that the structures can, the way things are set up, limits people's options, limits the choices they can make. And it's even stronger than that, actually. You think about some political systems, particularly in other parts of the world, but it's certainly we're not excluded from this in this country. There's a sort of a wholesale colonization of the mind going on that it's very difficult for people to sort of, scrape out from under. And so, individual people, without the support of others, can find it very hard to be free. And so I guess from the point of view of the faith, then, when it comes to issues of poverty and disadvantage, I still encounter far too many Christians who just want the poor to start making better choices, as if it was that easy. And so I think, I would like Christians more generally to recognise that there's a structure beyond the individual, And so, we need to be working at the level of the individual, but also at the level of the structure.
Yeah, that certainly has, that language has cropped up again, thinking in contemporary conversations around a whole raft of different issues, race being foremost, I suppose, in my mind just now. And there's interesting, I think there's interesting biblical precedent perhaps for it. Although I would want to hold on to, so I'm thinking here of the language of sin as a capital S, something that, as you were talking about there, captures and colonizes people's minds. This is quite common in sort of apocalyptic theology, that it's this actually invasive force. But I would want to hold on to the idea of sin as a sort of infraction. These are infractions of the law at an individual level, but it can be both. It's both. Thanks very much to Matt for giving his time and for sharing his thoughts. This is the penultimate episode of this series of Politics at the Crossroads. There will be one more episode next week, and then we'll be taking a break and having a rest. If you've enjoyed these conversations, or if you have constructive feedback that might improve the show, please leave a comment on the iTunes page. This will help to make the show better in the coming series. And if you have ideas for a future series or a future episode, please do get in touch. As always, thank you so much for listening. Politics at the Crossroads is a project of the Saeculum blog. Please go to www.thesaeculum, that's saeculum.com, for more commentary on Christianity and culture.